He had asked for a bride who could keep books, and the woman climbing down from the Bitter Spring stagecoach looked like she had never once balanced a column of figures in her life. Dutch Pharaoh stood at the depot with her letter in his coat pocket, the one that had promised, in a neat, careful hand, a woman of practical sense and orderly habits, well suited to managing a household ledger. What climbed down instead was a bright-eyed, laughing young woman in a traveling dress the color of ripe peaches, already chattering to the startled conductor about the beauty of the plains, a hatbox under one arm and a birdcage, an actual birdcage, empty, its purpose known only to her, under the other. "Mr. Pharaoh," she called across the platform, waving as if they were old friends rather than strangers arranged by post. "I'm Josie Calloway. Goodness, but this country is grand. I nearly fell out the window twice just looking at it." "Miss Calloway," Dutch said, removing his hat, already feeling some private certainty crumble beneath him, "I believe there's been some manner of mistake." "Oh, I do hope not," Josie said, undaunted. "I've come an awfully long way." Josie, for her part, had spent the entire stagecoach ride rehearsing what she would say to explain herself, and had arrived no closer to a satisfactory answer than when she'd boarded in Independence 3 weeks before. The marriage agency had matched her name to Dutch Pharaoh's advertisement on the strength of a single letter she'd written describing herself as capable, willing, and eager for a fresh start. Every word true, and not one of them mentioning arithmetic, because the subject had simply never come up, and because Josie had learned over 24 years of disappointing people who expected quieter, tidier things of her, that it was generally easier to let a disappointment arrive in its own time than to go looking for trouble by announcing it early. She had come west, if she was honest with herself, less for Dutch Pharaoh's advertisement than for the plain fact that Independence had run entirely out of patience with her. Her last position, keeping house for the Ashford family, had ended when Mrs. Ashford declared her too much personality for a household of quiet habits, which Josie privately considered one of the stranger insults she'd ever received, though it had stung all the same. A fresh start 300 miles west, promised to a rancher who wanted order and practicality, had seemed at the time like exactly the sort of sensible arrangement a disappointing woman ought to be grateful for. She had not expected, riding out across the endless gold plains, how badly she wanted this one particular sensible arrangement to actually want her back. There had in fact been no mistake of transit only, as it emerged over supper that first evening, a considerable mistake of expectation. Josie Calloway could not, by her own cheerful admission, add a column of numbers with any reliability whatsoever. "Numbers simply won't sit still for me," she explained, buttering a biscuit with the serene confidence of a woman discussing someone else's shortcoming entirely. "I've tried, Mr. Pharaoh, truly I have. My schoolteacher used to say I could charm a snake out of its skin but couldn't tell 4 from 40 if her life depended on it." Dutch set down his fork. "My advertisement asked specifically for a woman skilled in bookkeeping. I've 300 head of cattle, feed accounts, wages to figure, a bank note that comes due quarterly. I need a wife who can keep a ledger straight, Miss Calloway, not one who charms snakes." "Well," Josie said, entirely unbothered, "I don't know how the agency muddled it, but here I am regardless, and I'll say this much. I may not be able to add your figures, Mr. Pharaoh, but I don't imagine you married for arithmetic's sake alone, whatever you told yourself when you wrote that letter." Dutch, who had in fact told himself exactly that a practical marriage wanted a practical woman, orderly and useful, nothing more complicated than a fair trade of labor for shelter found, he had no immediate answer to that. The trouble, as he came to understand it over the following days, was not merely that Josie could not keep books. It was that she seemed constitutionally incapable of the orderly, quiet habits he had built his whole ranching life around. She rearranged his kitchen twice in the first week alone. She insisted on naming the barn cats, all 11 of them, with names like Duchess and Reverend Tom. She sang while she worked, loudly and with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and somehow persuaded 3 of his hands to join her on the chorus of a hymn none of them had sung since childhood. And then there was the matter of Diablo. Diablo was a Hereford bull of considerable size and considerably worse temper, so named by Dutch's ranch hands for his habit of charging any man fool enough to enter his pen without a very good reason and a very fast horse nearby. He had gored one hand's leg the previous spring badly enough to end the man's ranch work for good, and Dutch kept him fenced separate from the rest of the stock, approached only with extreme caution, and never, under any circumstances, alone. He came around the bunkhouse one gray Tuesday morning already calling for whichever fool hand had left the near pasture gate unlatched, and stopped dead at the sight of his new bride sitting on the top rail of Diablo's pen, humming, while the bull himself stood with his great head resting against the fence rail beside her, placid as a lamb, chewing something out of her open palm. For one terrible second Dutch's whole chest went hollow with fear. He had seen what that animal had done to Holly's Meeker's leg, had helped carry the man bleeding to the wagon himself, and every instinct in him screamed to shout, to run, to do something before the worst happened in front of his own eyes on his own land. He forced himself instead to move slow and quiet toward the fence, the way he'd have approached any spooked animal, his heart hammering harder than it had in years. "Miss Calloway," Dutch said, in a voice gone very careful, "step down from that rail slow and don't startle him." "Oh, he's no trouble at all," Josie said, entirely unconcerned, scratching the animal's broad forehead as though he were one of her 11 named barn cats. "He only wanted someone to talk to him plain and mean it. Bulls know when you're afraid of them, Mr. Farrow, same as horses do. I simply told him I wasn't and meant it, and here we are." That bull put Holly's Meeker in bed 6 weeks with a gored leg. "Well, I expect Mr. Meeker was afraid of him," Josie said. "Animals can tell. I've always had a way with the frightened ones. Frightened animals and frightened people both, if I'm honest, Mr. Farrow, though I don't suppose you've asked yourself yet whether you might count among either category." Dutch stood at the fence a long moment, watching his bride scratch the ears of the meanest animal on his property, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and felt something shift uneasily in his careful, orderly understanding of what use a wife was meant to be. "I didn't order a woman who talks to bulls, Miss Calloway," he said finally. "I ordered a bookkeeper." "I know it," Josie said, climbing down at last, dusting off her skirts. "And I am sorrier than I can rightly say that I'm not what you asked for. But I'll tell you plain, Mr. Farrow, since you seem a man who values plain speaking above most things. I've never once in my life been what anybody asked for. Not my mother, who wanted a quiet daughter and got a loud one. Not my last position, keeping house for a family who wanted someone invisible and got someone who sang at the washtub whether they liked it or not. I came out here hoping, foolishly perhaps, that a fresh start meant I might finally be wanted as I was, rather than measured against what I wasn't." Her cheerful composure cracked just slightly, just enough for him to see beneath it. "I'll go if you'd rather send me back. I won't hold you to an arrangement neither of us bargained for honestly." Dutch Farrow had built his whole life on practical, orderly things, fences that held, ledgers that balanced, a ranch run tight and lean with no room for waste or foolishness. He had told himself, writing that careful advertisement, that he wanted a wife cut from the same practical cloth, because practical things did not disappoint a man the way people so often did. But he looked now at the woman standing in his yard, offering to leave with no anger and no demands, only a quiet, wounded dignity that reminded him uncomfortably of every time in his own life he had felt measured and found wanting, and understood that he did not, in fact, want her to go. "Nobody's sending anybody back," he said, gruffer than he meant to sound. "I'll manage the books myself, same as I did before I ever wrote that fool advertisement. I only meant," he stopped, turned his hat over once in his hands, an old habit he'd never quite broken. "I only meant I don't rightly know what use I've got for a wife who can't add a column of figures." "Perhaps," Josie said, some of her brightness returning cautiously, "the use isn't in the adding at all, Mr. Farrow. Perhaps it's in the parts of a life a ledger never once accounted for. He did not have a ready answer for that either, and found, over the weeks that followed, that he stopped looking for one. She could not keep his books, but she kept his house lighter than it had been in years, filled with singing and named cats, and a warmth he had not realized until it arrived, how badly the place had been missing. She charmed his hands into better humor on hard days, coaxed the shyest of his horses into eating from her hand, and gentled Diablo so thoroughly that the old bull took to following her along his fence line like an oversized, devoted dog, to the endless amusement of every man on the place. The hands, who had watched her arrival with the same skepticism Dutch himself had felt, came around to her steadily over that first season. She learned each man's name and his troubles besides, whose mother was ailing back east, whose sweetheart had stopped writing, whose knee ached worse in wet weather, and made a point of asking after all of it at supper, until the bunkhouse table, once a place of hurried, silent eating, became something closer to a family gathering. Even the foreman, a taciturn man named Purdy who had worked the faro spread for 11 years and rarely wasted a word on anything that wasn't cattle, took to bringing her wildflowers from the north pasture, gruffly, without explanation, and pretending afterward he hadn't. Dutch found himself, against every practical instinct he'd built his life around, watching for her at supper, listening for her singing over the washtub, missing the particular chaos of her company on the rare afternoons she rode into town for supplies. It was Holly's Meeker himself, healed enough by autumn to hobble about on a cane, who said the thing plainly one evening that Dutch had been too stubborn to say to himself. "That bull hasn't charged a fence rail since your wife started talking to him," Meeker observed, watching Josie from the porch as she fed Diablo scraps from her apron. Man could learn something from an animal, that ornery, finally settling down peaceful Dutch. Sometimes the thing you ordered isn't half the thing you actually needed. Dutch turned that over for the better part of a week before he found her alone one evening in the kitchen, flour on her hands from a pie that would likely, by his own careful accounting, come out lopsided and imperfect and probably delicious anyway. "Josie," he said, and something in the way he said her given name, gentle and a little uncertain, made her look up sharply from her mixing bowl. "I've been keeping the books myself these 3 months, same as I said I would, and I've found I don't mind the arithmetic near so much as I thought I would, so long as I've got you singing somewhere in the house while I do it." "Dutch faro," Josie said, setting down her spoon. "Are you telling me, in your own particular roundabout fashion, that you're glad the agency sent you the wrong bride?" "I'm telling you," he said, crossing the kitchen to stand before her, flour and all, "that I don't believe they sent me the wrong bride at all. I believe I wrote the advertisement wrong from the start, asking for a woman to balance my ledgers when what I actually needed, without knowing it, was a woman to balance the rest of my life instead. I love you, Josie, plain as I know how to say it. Not despite the numbers you can't add, but for every last impractical, singing, bull-charming thing about you that I didn't know I was missing till you arrived." Josie's eyes went bright, her whole cheerful composure dissolving at last into something far more tender. "I came out here hoping to be wanted as I was," she said, "and I confess I'd nearly given up believing any man would want the whole disorderly truth of me. I love you too, Dutch, plain as anything, even if I never do learn to add a column of your figures properly." "I've decided," Dutch said, drawing her close, careless now of the flour transferring itself to his own shirt, "that I'll do the adding. You'll do the rest of it, the singing, the taming, the making a house feel like a home instead of just a place a man sleeps between chores. Seems a fair trade to me." "More than fair," Josie agreed, and kissed him, laughing, right there in the flour-dusted kitchen that had, somewhere in 3 short months, stopped being merely his house and become, instead, entirely theirs. They stood before the Bitter Springs preacher again that December to speak the vows properly, this time meaning every word of them in a way neither had quite managed on the hurried, practical afternoon of Josie's arrival, and half the county turned out to see it. Purdy the foreman brought, for the occasion, The largest bouquet of hothouse flowers Bitter Springs had ever seen delivered by a man too proud to admit outright that he'd grown fond of the bride who tamed his boss's meanest bull, and his own quiet heart besides. Outside in his pen by the barn, Diablo lowed once into the evening quiet, as if in placid agreement and Dutch pharaoh-practical, orderly. Once entirely certain he knew exactly what use a wife was meant to serve, laughed out loud at the sound of it, delighted for the first time in his careful life to have gotten something so completely, wonderfully wrong.